Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at this task and you've circled the words that you feel are appropriate, or you've identified the ones that are. So if I just run through the ones that are appropriate, and hopefully we've got the same answers, and while I go through, I can give you a bit of an explanation about some of them that you might not be too sure about. So on the top row we've got bisexual, which is obviously an appropriate term to describe the bisexual community. The others are inappropriate. On the next row we've got transsexual. That is an appropriate word to use, and traditionally it describes transgender people who have gone through gender reassignment surgery. So you might see that word used in the context of national governing body policies on transgender sports participation. So that word is still used in the context of sport. The other two words on that row are completely unacceptable. On the next line down, lesbian obviously describes gay women in sport, but if you think about it being used in the context of a negative slur in terms of identifying somebody as a lesbian because she plays hockey, therefore she must be, then obviously that's an inappropriate use of the word. The next row down, those three words are completely unacceptable. And then down from that we've got the row that starts with queer, transvestite and dyke. Transvestite actually describes somebody who dresses in the clothes of the opposite sex and doesn't traditionally fall within to the LGBT community, although it's often mistaken that it is. If you think about one of the most famous transvestites that you see on television, who is talks about it openly, we think about Eddie Izzard, for example, although he doesn't fit into the LGBT community. The word queer might be one that you think is unacceptable, but actually when you see LGBT literature or organisations, you might see the initials LGBTQI, where I stands for intersex and Q stands for queer. And you might think, okay, I feel that was an unacceptable word. Whereas actually, some people identify as queer. They might identify as queer in their sexuality. They might identify as queer in their gender identity. Again, obviously, we know when it's being used out of context and in a negative way, so it's just one to be aware of. The next row down, none of those words are acceptable. The same for the row after that begins with bender. And if you're thinking, what's IT? Well, it's actually it, which sometimes you hear or see perhaps on social media to describe transgender people in the sense of, so what is it then? Is it a he, is it a she? Which again is completely unacceptable. The next row down, obviously, transgender people describes people with a different gender identity to what their biological sex was at birth. And then the last row, we've got intersex, which we've already talked about, homosexual, which describes sexual orientation. And the last one is one that some people have a question mark by. Transgendered isn't a word that's appropriate. In fact, I don't even think it is a word, but it is a word that some people use to describe a transgender person, in the sense of, oh yeah, she's transgendered, or he's transgendered. A bit like it's an affliction, like, oh yeah, he's disabled. Whereas it's inappropriate, and the only way to describe a transgender person is, either by their preferred first name, for example, but transgender woman or transgender man. So hopefully that's helped you to understand some of the language and terminology. And what we need to think about here is not just, okay, I know what means what and what shouldn't be used and what should be used, but also to try and challenge you in terms of, well, do you hear this language? And if you do, how do you challenge it? Or do you challenge it? What are the best ways to challenge it? Or is it part of sport and is it just accepted? Well, to create change and to be able to kind of challenge some of the negative language within sport, we do need to start standing up for it. And there are different ways to do that which don't create confrontation. So for example, coming back to some of the campaigns that your club might want to get involved with, the Rainbow Laces campaign, the Football versus Homophobia campaign, and having perhaps an LGBT role model within your club that is happy to talk about their experiences, which hopefully culturally starts to change some of the language that's used. But then there can be just the good old-fashioned, not confrontation, but conversation about the language that's being used in terms of, I don't think that's acceptable, I don't think we should be using the language like that anymore. That takes a certain amount of confidence, and especially if you think about challenging language perhaps in a sporting environment, such as a football match or a rugby match, where you might hear something from the stands or from the person next to you, How do you challenge that? There's always the opportunity, if you don't feel comfortable doing it straight away, to do something about it afterwards, to speak to a steward afterwards, or to pop an email to the club, or even just to message them on social media, just to say, hey, you know what, this guy 2 rows down from me was using extremely inappropriate language, and I think something should be done about it. There's also a useful app that's used in football called the Kick It Out app, and that might be something that you want to look into and see how that's being used across the Premier League and Championship. This next slide is a really useful visual tool to explain a bit more about LGBT and to understand that it's not just about fitting in specific particular boxes. So we've got, if you have a look at the biological sex part, that describes obviously the biological sense of being male or female. If you think about gender identity, then that's up here in the head, and that's about how you identify either as a man or woman, or maybe even genderqueer, as we've already talked about, and also how you express your identity, whether that be in the language behaviours that you use or in the way that you dress. And then when we talk about sexual orientation, that comes back to who you're sexually attracted to. So when we talk about LGBT, we're talking about 2 separate things. We're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, and obviously each one of us comes from a different biological sex as well. So what we have next for you is a short film that brings all of this topic to life. And our network made this film in partnership with 4 Welsh people who play sport at different levels for different organisations. We have a gay woman, we have a gay man, we have a bisexual man, and we also have a transgender woman. And I think what's really important about this film is to just have a listen to their own personal experiences in terms of some of the barriers and issues that they faced, both externally from the outside community, but also internally from their own thoughts and feelings as well about some of the barriers for them to engage in sport. It finishes on a very positive note in terms of how they've tried to overcome some of those barriers, and this video will then lead into a number of short case studies that you can complete yourself to have a look at different ways that you can reduce the stigma around LGBT people in sport, but also to support more people from the community to engage within sport as well.